on? Testing? Good. Okay, let's have a word of prayer before we get started. Father in heaven, Lord, we ask for your wisdom and guidance, Lord, as we look at different events and things that are happening and have happened, Father. And Lord, we ask that you help us to understand the nature of those events in relation to Bible prophecy. In Jesus' name, amen. Let me grab my Bible real quick. Hope that doesn't mess up the speaker. Well, our evangelism, not to be portraying it as something that, the other Protestant churches are doing as well, but making sure that it is unique to the three angels message. So just wanted to give that clarification. Some people were asking me recently about my different cases. I didn't really plan to talk about that, but just to give you a snippet, I've been doing religious liberty work since 2012. Actually before that, but that was as an intern. And then once I got my law degree in 2011, I worked a year doing estate and tax law. And then I got, God led me into religious liberty in 2012. And since then, I've been doing a lot of different cases, a lot of Sabbath accommodation cases. I had one case go up to the United States Supreme Court 2 years ago in 2023 for a postal worker who was being terminated and disciplined and heading to termination because he wouldn't deliver Amazon packages on Sunday, and he kept a 24-hour Sunday Sabbath. We got a chance to have some neat conversations with him about the biblical Sabbath, and he actually came to church with us once. So hopefully some seeds were planted there. But that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it changed the standard for what employers have to show in order to get out of providing individuals with a religious accommodation. So it really strengthened the laws across the board for everyone who wants a religious accommodation. And it was a very timely decision. It came down in June of 2023, around the same time where all of the COVID vaccine religious accommodation litigation was starting to take place. And so it really put employers, made it a lot harder for them to not accommodate individuals who had a sincere religious objection to the vaccine. I've been handling a lot of those cases. Most all of them have settled for significant dollar amounts. I just took one case to trial against the County of Los Angeles, who fired my client. She was a physician's assistant working at the county hospital, and the county terminated her because she wouldn't get vaccinated. And so we finally got to trial and got a favorable ruling in February of this year, where we won $911,000 for her, and also got her, the court ordered the county to reinstate her to her position as well. Plus, they ordered them to pay all of my attorney's fees, and so that was also nice as well. And I was very thankful. With just a little plug, the Pacific Union sponsored the case and paid for the cost, not my fees, but the cost. You know, it takes money to bring a case to trial. You have court reporter fees, you have filing fees, you have process server fees, you know, deposition transcript fees, and so there's lots of different costs to bring a case to trial, and the Pacific Union Religious Liberty Department sponsored all those costs. So I was very thankful for that and for their support. So yeah, doing a lot of these COVID cases, we're seeing a lot of good results. You know, like I said, the majority have settled. I've had the one go to trial and haven't lost any or got any that has gone to a final judgment against my client so far. So I just want to share that encouragement. All right, let's get into the topic then. So if you have your Bibles, Revelation 13:11, we've been talking about the beast from the earth. And this one says, again, I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and spake as a dragon. And so we know this beast represents the United States rising to power, and we talked about the two horns representing the separation there of church and state. You know, it could also represent the two forms of power being federal and state power, because the nation was unique in that it had, you know, state power as well as federal power. But prophetically, it's talking about the separation of church and state powers. And so this beast, it looks Christ-like, looks like a lamb, but then it starts to become the mouthpiece of the dragon. And so what I want to focus on there is that speaking of a dragon. Now, how does a dragon speak? With laws? Yeah, literally though, yeah, fire, thank you. I was meaning more in the literal sense. You know, you imagine this lamb and you go up and you're going to pet this cute lamb and all of a sudden fire comes out of his mouth and consumes you, right? And that's kind of what, you know, God is portraying that the United States would be like. You know, it's supposed to, it looks Christian and it's this nice, loving, right, Christian thing, and then all of a sudden fire comes out and consumes you because you don't follow its Christian ideas, right? And so this beast, it's also later called in Revelation the false prophet, because it's prophesying, but it's a false prophecy, right? It has false ideas about Bible prophecy and trying to bring in God's kingdom here on earth. And so it's a false prophet. So how does the dragon speak? Great Controversy says, the speaking as a dragon plainly foretells a development of the spirit of intolerance and persecution that was manifested by the nations represented by the dragon and the leopard-like beast. And so Ellen White here is referring to the Dark Ages when Rome was controlling the powers of Europe and was intolerant to anyone that thought differently than what Rome or the Catholic Church said was correct doctrine. And so the United States will, according to Bible prophecy, will likewise develop that same spirit of intolerance. And it'll be similar and even worse than what we have witnessed throughout European history. And so it starts to reflect the papacy, in that the papacy used the kings and their armies of Europe to enforce their religious dogmas and decrees. And so the United States will do the same thing. The Protestant churches will use the state government to enforce their religious ideology. And so America will then be a reflection of the papacy, a reflection of that first beast, and would be an image of it. You know, you look in the mirror, you see your image. She says the speaking of the nation is the action of its legislative and judicial authorities. And so when it's talking about the beast speaking, it's talking about legislative and judicial. Now, what's missing there? We have three branches of government, right? We have our legislative branch, our judicial branch, and our executive branch. Now, it's interesting, she doesn't mention executive branch, and I wonder why that is, because a lot of things are happening right now with executive orders, right? Coming from the executive branch. So I don't know if there's something to be taken from that or not, but I have often wondered why it leaves out the executive branch. But maybe it's because the Sunday law comes through Congress passing legislation and not through an executive order. And then it's upheld by the Supreme Court through a judicial decree. So I don't know. But anyways, let's get back to Revelation chapter 13. In verse 14, it says, and he deceives those that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by a sword and did live. So who is telling who to make the image? The state, the beast from the earth, is telling the people of the earth to make the image to the beast, right? And so we see here that this is talking about a government that is run by the people, right? It's telling the people of the earth that you need to make the image. And so the people of the earth are the ones that rule and govern the beast of the earth. And so the political powers telling the people that you need to make this image to the beast. So this is the first time that we see the lamb-like beast speaking. And it's speaking by telling those who dwell on the earth, the U.S. government telling the citizens to make an image to the beast, right? Now in verse 15, it changes. It says, and he had power to give life unto the image of the beast. Do you see that? Instead of the image to the beast. It says the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So is there a difference between an image to something and an image of something? Yes. So when I went to the Supreme Court in 2023, I had the chance to go there along the Capitol Mall and see the different monuments. Anybody been to D.C. and seen all the different monuments? Okay. So I saw the Washington Monument, and right there on the beautiful lawn, the obelisk, and it's at least it says it's a memorial to George Washington, right? Now, does it look like George Washington? No. So it's an image to George Washington, but it's not an image of George Washington, right? But then, you take a little stroll a couple hundred yards down to the Lincoln Memorial, and inside, about 2 or 3 stories tall, is a giant statue of Lincoln sitting in a big chair, right? Now, is that an image to Lincoln or an image of Lincoln? Of, right? It looks like him. And so the first one is an honor to George Washington, but the second one actually looks like Lincoln. And so what I extrapolate from this is that there's going to be two stages to the Sunday law. One is an honor to Rome, but then at some point when the Sunday law is enforced, like forced worship, is then America looks like Rome, right? It's actually an image of Rome. So the first one might just be maybe something like Project 2025, where you have to, just rest on Sunday. You don't have to worship. There's not forced worship on Sunday. You can still worship on your Sabbath. And so that would be an image to Rome. That would be honoring Rome, but it wouldn't be necessarily looking like Rome because it's not forcing Sunday worship yet. Now, Ellen White also talks about there being two stages. Now, I think, honestly, that there's probably some little stages here in between these, but these are kind of the two overarching stages of the Sunday law from my reading and study. So this is from Review and Herald, April 6, 1911. It says, "The time will come when men will not only forbid Sunday work." So what have they been doing? Forbidding Sunday work, right? So that had happened, or in this statement that had happened. They'll not only forbid it, but then they will try to force men to labor on the Sabbath. So that means now you can't even keep your Sabbath, and men will be asked to renounce the Sabbath and to subscribe to Sunday observance or forfeit their freedom and their lives. And so you see that two-stage. First, it's that you're forbidden to do work. So you can still keep your Sabbaths on Saturday, and you don't have to worship on Sunday, but you just can't work on Sunday, right? You have to rest. And so that's kind of the first stage. But she says then they will force you to actually labor on your Sabbath. So you're not even allowed to rest on your Sabbath. Now, I don't know how, that's... I don't know how that plays in with the whole narrative of climate change. It seems like they would want more people to rest on more days, right? It's better we rest on 2 days because that's less harming the climate, right? You'd think, according to their arguments. But anyways, so they're going to force Sabbath labor, and they will also then force us to subscribe, or force everyone to subscribe to Sunday observance at pain of freedom and death. And so the first phase is legislation to forbid Sunday work, and then the second phase is legislation to force Sabbath labor and to force Sunday worship. And so I think reading Revelation chapter 13, we kind of see that in, it's the image to the beast, where you can, we're forbidding Sunday work, and so we're kind of honoring Rome and the day that they have set up. But then eventually it's an image of the beast when we actually force people to labor on Sabbath and force them to worship on Sunday. Now, in order to do this, how is that possible with our Constitution, right? The First Amendment, the very first amendment, the first thing our founders were thinking about when they added a Bill of Rights to the Constitution was religious freedom. That was the most important thing on their minds, right? And it says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or for prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so we have those two clauses there that go hand in hand. Congress can't make a law respecting a religion, so something that advances a religion, and they also can't make a law that prohibits you from freely exercising your religious beliefs. And so with that, it seems like it would be very difficult for this nation to have a Sunday law in that scenario, right? And so how do we get around that? How would they get around that? It seems like the first phase, you have to rest on Sunday. It seems like that would violate the Establishment Clause, right? That's advancing a particular denomination's religious belief. And then the second phase, that's forcing you to worship and forcing you to work on your day, would violate your free exercise, right? And so you see both clauses would have to be violated there by the two different steps of the Sunday law. And so how would we get around this? Well, there's a couple options. One, we could change the Constitution, right? There's been movements in the past, and they tried to do that back when they were in the 1880s. And there's people that have talked about it now, changing the Constitution. But that's not easy to do. You need 2/3 a vote in both houses of Congress, which, given our current climate, seems like that would be difficult to get through. However, you look at the trial of Christ, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees all came together to convict him. So, anything's possible. But then, not only that, you need then 3/4 of the states to ratify it. So you need not only, both houses of Congress to a supermajority to agree, but you also need 3/4 of the states to then ratify it. So it's not an easy task to have a constitutional amendment, right? It seems, with the polarization here in this country, that it seems like it would be pretty impossible to get a Sunday law or to change the Constitution to remove the freedom of religion. And by the way, though, there's talk that the separation of church and state is not mentioned in the Constitution. It's mentioned right here. I mean, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause is the separation of church and state. It's telling the state to keep its hands off of religion and also to not prohibit anybody from exercising their religious beliefs. And so while it didn't use those exact words, we see the principles of it here in the First Amendment. Okay, so here's a quote from Ellen White. She says, "By the decree enforcing the institution of the papacy in violation of the law of God, our nation will disconnect herself fully from righteousness. Our country shall repudiate every principle of its constitution as a Protestant and Republican government, and shall make provision for the propagation of papal falsehoods and delusions. Then we may know that the time has come for the marvelous working of Satan, and that the end is near." Now, my understanding is the marvelous working of Satan maybe is his appearance. I don't know. So it seems like that comes after we violate the law of God by instituting a Sunday law, or at least the start of a Sunday law. Anyway, she says that it shall repudiate every principle. So what does it mean to repudiate? Well, if you look in the dictionary, it says repudiate means to refuse to fulfill or to accept. And so I don't know if necessarily the Constitution will be revoked or amended. It seems like what she is saying here is that it's repudiated. In other words, the people refuse to follow it. So maybe the Constitution's still there, but people refuse to follow the different clauses of the Constitution. And have we seen the court refuse to follow the Constitution? One way that they can do that is by reinterpreting the Constitution, right? And that's what the Supreme Court's job is, to interpret the meaning of the laws that Congress has passed, or interpret the meaning of the Constitution. And so remember, it only takes 5 Americans to change your constitutional right. 5 Americans, right? 5 Supreme Court justices are all that are needed to change what your constitutional rights are. And we saw this in the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Now, I'm not here to say whether Roe versus Wade should have been decided the way it was in the first place, but I think it's interesting to look at because in 1973, our Supreme Court, a majority of the justices declared that abortion was a constitutional right. So they said, under the Constitution, you have a constitutional right to this. And then we saw just a couple of years ago in the Dobbs decision where the Supreme Court said, nope, you don't have a constitutional right. And so our constitutional rights could be changed at the whim of the stroke of a pen, right? As long as 5 of our justices agree. And so they can reinterpret what this means to a way that suits the fancy of the powers that be. And so one way that I've seen this happen is that they secularize religion. And so instead of something being religious, we'll say it's secular now, and so then it doesn't come under the First Amendment, right? Because it's secular. And so we've seen them do this with the Ten Commandments. You guys remember the Ten Commandment cases? So one of them, 2005, Van Orden versus Perry, and he had to drive, Mr. Van Orden had to drive by the Texas State Capitol on his way to work every day, and or he would drive by it to go to the library, and he wondered, how come I have to look at this 10 Commandments on government property when I drive by? This seems like it's a violation of the Constitution. And so he filed a lawsuit, and that went up to the United States Supreme Court. And he was saying the 6-foot-tall monument there on the government property was unconstitutional. The court said, well, 10 Commandments have a secular purpose. And so it's not really religious to the reasonable person. They would think, oh, this is just a secular thing. Government's not really endorsing religion. Now, have you ever looked at the 10 Commandments and thought, man, that's a secular document? Anybody here? No, right? And so they say, the displaying of it wasn't motivated by societal, it was motivated by societal concerns, the decline of morality, which I would argue morality is a religious thing, right? We get morals from God. Government doesn't have the right to legislate morality. Government has the right to legislate civility, right? How man relates to his fellow man. But as far as morals, what's going on in man's mind or heart for why he is carrying out the action he's carrying out is something between man and God. And so I think the court got it wrong there that government's allowed to address morality. But it says that, this wasn't part of a back to church initiative. The government wasn't trying to get people to go back to church. And so, it's a secular, kind of got a secular purpose, so we're going to allow it. So they said it doesn't violate the Establishment Clause because there's a secular purpose to the monument. We saw this again in 2019, the Bladensburg cross case. This is a 40-foot tall cross. Anybody here been to Bladensburg, Maryland? Okay, well, there's this 40-foot tall cross there on government property, and it's a monument to honor those who died in World War I. Now, I don't know if it was only Christians that died in World War I or not, but, anyways, that honors them regardless of their religious faith, I guess. These people, the government was going to take it down, and these Christians argued that to keep it up, these other secular entities were wanting it to be taken down. And so what they argued to the Supreme Court was that the cross was really a secular symbol. Now, if we're having to make those sort of arguments to get our way, something's wrong, right? When we're having to degrade our religious values and things, making them secular in order to get them in the public display, I think we have a problem there. And so this went up to the Supreme Court. Now, as a Christian, we might think, what's the big deal with the Ten Commandments? What's the big deal with the cross? But let's think about this a little differently. What if that was a giant statue of Baphomet, or some sort of satanic symbol, or the Muslim creche, or something like that? Would you have a problem if that was a 40-foot tall symbol on government property? But Christians, oh, it's a cross, that's okay, right? Or the Ten Commandments. What if it was Sharia law there displayed on the Texas Capitol property, or some other, religious law from another sort of denomination? So if we're not okay with that, then we shouldn't be okay with this, right? This is why, government needs to keep its hands off religion. Let the churches do religion, right? Did God give his great commission to the state? No, he gave it to his disciples, right? His people. It's God's people that have the duty to go and make disciples and baptize in all nations, right? He didn't say to the governments of the world and the state, you need to go make disciples. You need to baptize all nations, right? His great commission was to his followers, not to the government. And so the government needs to keep its paws off of religion. But here the court said, well, they're kind of right. The cross, even though it originated as a Christian symbol, is taken on a secular meaning. Here, its secular meaning is just to remember those who died in World War I. So we're going to allow this to stand. Now, like I said, what if a Muslim had died in World War I? I'm sure there some were, or some sort of other religious faith. Would we have a problem with a 40-foot tall symbol of their religion on government property and say, oh, it's just a secular thing, memorializing that? I think we'd have a problem with that. And so what the Supreme Court has done is they've secularized religious things in order to allow them to skirt around the Establishment Clause issue in these cases. And so they say it's not really an Establishment Clause violation because it's a secular purpose. And we saw this first happen in McGowan versus Maryland. Now, this is the famous Sunday Blue Law case. Now, Maryland passed a law titled Sabbath breaking. Now, does that sound like a secular law or like a religious law? A religious law. There's nothing secular about that title, right? And it forbid, this is a quote from the legislation, work or bodily labor on the Lord's day. It says that right there in the legislation. It didn't stop there. It also forbid people from profaning the Lord's day. So you couldn't even profane it, okay? By gaming, by fishing, by doing all these other things. And it referred to Sunday as the Sabbath day. Well, this man went into the store, and stores were only allowed to sell essential items like milk, bread, gasoline, and tobacco, essential things. And so it wasn't just civil penalties that you would get if you sold more than that. You would also, it was a violation of, it was a criminal statute. And so there were criminal penalties if you sold other items. So some patron came in and wanted to buy a three-ring loose leaf binder, a can of floor wax, a stapler, and some staples. And so the store sold it to them, and somebody reported the store, and the store was criminally indicted for violating Maryland law, for selling these items on Sunday, violating the Sabbath law. And so this case went up to the United States Supreme Court, and it was there that they upheld Sunday closing laws, and they said, these have a practical secular purpose. And so what happened was, when it went up to the Supreme Court, the governor or the state of Maryland forsook the religious purpose and started arguing, well, it's got all these secular purposes to it. Even though the law still said that it was still called Sabbath breaking, right? And still had the Lord's Day in it. But they're saying, well, it's actually, all these other secular reasons. And so Sunday closing laws, they said, are based on secular rather than religious state interests. The laws are to improve the health and safety and recreation and general well-being of citizens. They present the present purpose of the laws is to provide a uniform day of rest for all. The fact that this day is of particular significance for various Christian sects does not bar the state from achieving its secular goals. So the Supreme Court just stuck its head in the sand and said, you know what, we're not going to see anything religious about this law, even though it says it's Sabbath breaking and the Lord's Day. And we're going to say, it's a secular purpose for the well-being of citizens and a day of rest for all. Are we seeing those same arguments being put forth for a Sunday law today? And so the Supreme Court approved of this back in 1961, that these Sunday laws, when states require businesses and people to rest, you can't go fishing. We saw that clip from the Hitchcock TV show, right? You couldn't even go fishing on Sunday. You have to rest, and they're hoping, I'm sure, that you go to their churches, right? Now, it's interesting because 2 weeks before the Supreme Court came out with its ruling, the Vatican, Pope John the 23rd, issued an encyclical. And he said, the Catholic Church has decreed for many centuries that Christians observe this day of rest on Sunday. We exhort all men, whether public officials or representatives of management and labor, that they observe this command of God himself and of the Catholic Church, and judge in their souls that they have a responsibility to God and society in this regard. Maybe it's just a coincidence that, Pope John the 23rd issued this a couple weeks before the Supreme Court ruled on the case. I don't know. You can decide that. But I do find that timing rather interesting. And so, but this, you might say, well, that was 1961, and, we have different Supreme Court justices now, and things are different, right? Well, there was a case back in 2022 called Kennedy versus Bremerton. Do you guys remember that case about the coach from Washington State who would pray on the 50-yard line before or after each football game? And the high school told the coach that he couldn't do that. Now, this case was interesting because there was a question of fact. Was he requiring the football players, or maybe not requiring, but kind of twisting their arm to pray with him, or was it something that he was doing on his own time privately, or was he having the players do this as well? And so typically the Supreme Court is not a court, a fact-finding court. So at its level, the highest level, all it is deciding the law, how the law is to be interpreted and whether the court below, got the law correct. So by the time a case gets to the Supreme Court, the facts in the case have supposed to have already been found out by the trier of fact, either the jury or the judge at the lowest level of court. That's where all the facts are presented, and the different sides argue which facts are true or not, and people's credibility is tested, and documents are brought forth. And so it's at that level, that lower level, where the court decides what is the facts in the case. And then they apply the law to those facts. Well, in this case, you had two sets of facts. It's very interesting if you read the Supreme Court's opinion, because the majority of the justices take one set of facts, where, the coach was praying by himself, he did it on his own time, he wasn't on the clock, that sort of thing. And then the minority opinion, in this case, took the other side's set of facts, that no, he was doing this on school time, he was supposed to be, watching the students, and he was having all the students come with him to pray. And so, you have this teacher in this position of authority representing the government that's having, kids give a Christian prayer. And so, completely two different sets of facts. And so, just because you are a public employee doesn't mean you give up your right to pray, right? But you can't then, force other people, in your position as a public official to also engage in prayer, right? And so, depending on which set of facts you looked at, depending which way you came, but the court should have never taken it in the first place. It should have sent it back down to have the lower court figure out what the true facts in the case were. But the court, I think, wanted to decide this, at least the majority did. And it was interesting, this case didn't get much attention in 2022 because that was when, the Dobbs decision was leaked and then later came out on the same week that this Bremerton case came out. And so that was getting all the media attention. But this case, I think, has far more implications to our country and to religious freedom than Roe versus Wade does. And what the court did here was it changed how it determined a violation of the Establishment Clause. So before, there was this test that the Supreme Court would go through to see if a violation of the Establishment Clause occurred. And it was called the Lemon Test. And it says, the law or regulation must have a secular purpose. Its primary effect cannot advance a religion or inhibit a religion. And it can't foster an entanglement of government and religion. And so if it passes that test, then it doesn't violate the Establishment Clause. Well, the court threw that out. Said, we're getting rid of the Lemon Test. We're just going to look at history and tradition. If we allowed something in the history and tradition of our nation, we're going to say it doesn't violate the Establishment Clause. But if we didn't allow it, then it does violate the Establishment Clause. Now, I think, this will have far-reaching implications. It's a very subjective test. What history and tradition are you looking to? How far back are you going? Because, you go too far back in the history of our nation. We had state-sponsored churches, right? Up until, the 1830s, where states had official churches and we had pastors on salary. And some places you had to be part of a certain religion or, in order to vote, or at least you couldn't be a Jew or a Catholic to vote, or things like that. And so how far back and what state's history and tradition are we looking at? And another problem with this is that, remember, the Constitution originally did not apply to the states. It wasn't until after the Civil War that we got the 14th Amendment, where it applied the Constitution to the states. And so, so how can you look at the history and tradition of what states were doing when the First Amendment didn't even apply to them at that point in time, right? And so I think there's a lot of problems with this. And so you look back at the history and tradition of our nation, when the Constitution wasn't applying to the states, the states had Bible reading in schools, right? And they had, 10 Commandments were able to be read and displayed and taught. And so now what you're seeing is that because they changed the law, it's opened the floodgates, and religious organizations see this as open season, right? And so that's why we're seeing all these states now passing laws requiring, Bible reading in public schools and requiring 10 Commandments to be displayed and requiring prayer and things, because the Supreme Court changed the test. If we allowed it in our history and tradition, then then it's not a violation of the Establishment Clause. And so these cases are going up to the Supreme Court now. They're working their way through the courts. So it'll be interesting to see what the court does with these cases. I'm not at all confident that the court will uphold the Establishment Clause, and I think it's been severely eroded by this Bremerton decision. Now, Ellen White tells us in The Great Controversy that when the leading churches of the United States, uniting upon such points of doctrine as are held by them in common, shall influence the state to enforce their decrees and sustain their institutions, then Protestant America will have formed an image of the Roman hierarchy, and the infliction of civil penalties upon dissenters will inevitably result. And so there's two parts to forming the image. There is the enforcement of decrees when they go to the state and say, hey, enforce our religion. So, require people to read the Bible, require people to read the Ten Commandments, or require people to rest on Sunday. And when they go to the state to sustain their institutions, when they go to the state to get money to keep their churches and schools and hospitals going, she says, then Protestant America has formed the image. And it looks like Rome, right? Because Rome is supported by the governments of this world and the Vatican government, the Catholic churches, and it uses the states to enforce their decrees. And so are we seeing churches and religious institutions going to the state to enforce their religious ideology and to get financial support from the state? Well, let's look a little bit about this. You would think that financial support from the state would be something that would violate the Constitution, right? Why should I, as a taxpayer, have to give money to the state to support other religions that I don't believe in, right? And why should other taxpayers have to give money to support my religious institutions and beliefs? And so up until June of 2017, the states were allowed to refuse to provide financial support to religious institutions based on the Establishment Clause. But something happened in 2017. There was a case, Trinity Lutheran versus the state of Missouri. And what happened was Missouri had a program that they were using recycled tires, and people could, different institutions could apply to have this state-sponsored program redo their playgrounds with a surface using recycled rubber. And so Trinity Lutheran Church said, man, our pee-wee gravel looks a little old, and it might be nice to have a nice rubber playground for our kids, keep them safe. And so they applied to this program, and they got denied because their application was rejected because they were a religious institution. They'd asked for $20,000 to resurface their playground with recycled tires, and the state rejected it. So they filed a lawsuit to get the money to improve their facility there. And the district court threw out the case saying, that just as we've held in the prior centuries of this country, the state's not required to use taxpayer dollars to benefit religion. It's a violation of the Establishment Clause. And so they appealed up to the circuit court and lost there, and then appealed to the United States Supreme Court. And there, the United States Supreme Court held for the very first time that the Constitution requires the government to provide public funds directly to a church. This was the first time it ever held that. it changed and forever changed the relationship of church and state in this country. The majority held that the government may not discriminate against religion when providing funding for a non-religious purpose. So they said, look, it's a non-religious purpose. I mean, it's just a playground. What's the big deal, right? And so, you know, you're discriminating against the church because, you know, they're a religious organization. It's not even going to, you know, teach religion. And so the court, you know, approved it on those grounds. Well, Sotomayor, who I'm not usually in agreement with, but here I am, she wrote in her dissent, the court today profoundly changes that relationship, talking about between church and state, by holding for the first time that the Constitution requires the government to provide public funds directly to a church. Its decisions slight both our precedent and our history. Now remember, they said here that it's just because it's going for a non-religious purpose. Well, 2 years later, we had a case called Espinoza versus Montana. And Montana established a program to provide tuition assistance to parents who send their children to private schools. However, it denied those scholarship funds if they were going to a religious institution. And so some people filed a lawsuit saying, hey, we should get these funds to go to our religious institution, and you know, this isn't right. And so that case went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against the state of Montana. And guess what case it cited as its precedent? The Trinity Lutheran case, right? You know, you can see the step. What did I say Friday night? One step in the wrong direction leads its way to another, right? And so it's a building block. And so here, the court relied on that 2017 decision of Trinity Lutheran and held that it was discriminatory for the state to deny the funds to religious schools merely because they happen to be religious. So here, the Supreme Court said the state's not making a distinction about whether the school teaches religion or not. You know, the school might not even teach religion. It might just happen to be religion. Like it might, maybe religion fell in its lap. I don't know. Just happened to be that way. And so you're discriminating against them based on their status as religious, not because, you know, they teach religion. And so the court required funding there, saying this is also a non-religious purpose because, you know, these schools aren't necessarily teaching religion. We don't know that. And so it found that this was discriminatory. Well, the great state of Maine wisened up. Anybody here from Maine? So they saw the handwriting on the wall, and so they passed a law that said that if a school teaches religion, then it cannot get funding, public funding, you know, for that institution. Well, Carson didn't like that very much, so they sued the state, and this went up to the United States Supreme Court in 2022, the Carson versus Macon case. And, you know, Maine had this tuition assistance program for kids who live in districts where there isn't any public schools. And so parents could designate a school for Maine to send money to, since Maine didn't have a public school in that area. But for schools that taught religion, Maine said, we're not doing that because that violates the Establishment Clause. And so this went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, relying on Trinity Lutheran and Espinoza, but remember, those cases, it said, you know, secular purpose, or you know, non-secular purpose, I mean. Well, here, Maine's law said we won't provide it to institutions that are teaching religion. So it said this is for a religious purpose, right? Well, the Supreme Court didn't care. They said you're discriminating against religious institutions. You know, that's discriminatory and not right. And the dissent here felt or said, we have never previously held what this court holds today, namely that a state must use state funds in order to pay for religious education. And so here you saw the complete overturning, the flipping upside down of the Establishment Clause. where now it's discriminatory if we do not provide government funds to help religion. And so, I think this is, very in line with Bible prophecy and with what Ellen White says about, the churches and religious institutions going to the state to get money. And now the state has declared that it is constitutional, not only constitutional, but it's required for the state to give institutions the money to sustain their institutions. Now, Maine wisened up after this, and so they passed a new law that said, okay, fine, we will give the money to institutions that teach religion, but not if they discriminate based on other categories. So basically, if your school teaches, or does not hire LGBT teachers or individuals, or doesn't allow students to express themselves in that way, or to live in student housing, with their married same-sex partner or things like that, then you're not going to get the funds. So there's another lawsuit right now in the process challenging this new Maine law that I'm sure will make it up to the Supreme Court. So we'll see what happens with that. We also saw with COVID where the Paycheck Protection Program, the very first time where federal dollars went to pay pastors' salaries. So you guys remember COVID, right? We all remember that. And that shut down all our businesses. So Congress rushed this Paycheck Protection Program to help businesses who were forced to shut down so that you could apply for money for your business from the government, because the government was requiring you to shut down so that you could pay your workers even though you couldn't be open and earn income. And at first, when Congress passed this law, it excluded religious institutions. But the Catholic Church went and lobbied Trump and Congress to amend it to allow it to apply to religious institutions. And so it was changed like a few weeks after it. And this was from Business Insider magazine. It says that the Catholic Church may be the largest recipient of the federal coronavirus aid, with as much as $3.5 billion went to the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is very good about getting funds from the state. They've had centuries of practice of extrapolating state funds to support their institutions. And so we see them here following like character. The leopard doesn't change its spots. And they go and they get as much as $3.5 billion. It was probably more than that because, you only had, it was only publicly listed, I think, when somebody got more than, was it $50,000 or something? And so, if smaller parishes got amounts less than that, we wouldn't know that. But of all the aid, over $7.3 billion went to religious institutions. And so a lot of our government money, that is, our government gets from us, taxpayers, went to pay pastors' salaries. And it wasn't just the Catholics. Adventists, some conferences and churches took it as well. And so the government was funding religious institutions. Now, if a religious institution is worth anything at all, you would think that its congregants would fund its religious activities, right? If the congregants aren't willing to fund the projects and institutions that they follow, then why should the state find that it's willing, that it's worthy of being funded, right? So we need the state to not be able to be rated by religion. And what really bothers me about this is that at this time, you had all these lawsuits against the Catholic Church coming to a head for all their sexual misdeeds. And they had, it was reported, approximately $4 billion in settlements for their sex abuse cases. And so at this time, and so the government pretty much paid off, all of their abuses to all of the people that they had wrongly abused. And so in other words, taxpayer dollars went to pay the Catholic Church's misdeeds. And to me, that is just corruption of the highest order. And this is why we need this separation of church and state. If James Madison saw this, he's probably rolling over in his grave right now. But they haven't stopped there. Has anybody heard about the St. Isidore of Seville school in Oklahoma? So this is the very first publicly funded public Catholic school. It's obviously an oxymoron. It can't be public if it's Catholic, right? So the first in the nation public religious school. So the Archdiocese of Oklahoma decided that he was going to create a publicly funded Catholic school. And so he went to the Department of Education there, the Oklahoma School Board, and they voted to approve by a 3-2 vote that Oklahoma would allow the Catholic Church to run the first ever publicly funded religious school. And so the Archbishop says, we're going to run this just like every Catholic school. We're going to teach Catholic theology, but any child can come, and it's going to be, they don't have to pay anything. It's going to be fully funded by the state. And so it's basically a state public school. And so there was a lawsuit filed against this, and that this was obviously a clear violation of the Establishment Clause. Actually, it was the Attorney General of Oklahoma that filed a lawsuit against this, saying, whoa, you can't do this. And so that went up to the Supreme Court of Oklahoma, and they said, yes, this violates both the state constitution and the federal constitution. Well, the Catholic school petitioned for cert to the United States Supreme Court, and they granted cert in, I believe it was January this year. An oral argument is this coming week in this case, so keep that in prayer. But I met the attorney at a religious liberty conference in LA last year who's handling this case, and he's from University of Notre Dame, and he believes that he's going to win the case, that he has a very favorable Supreme Court, and given the Carson versus Macon decision, the Trinity Lutheran decision, the Espinoza decision, that he believes the court's going to find that it's discriminatory for them not to allow the Catholic Church to run a public school. So I think it's going to be a very interesting case. And this was a news article about it, Catholic Charter School. And the article says, the state and church are entwined as has never happened before. He added, this was the Attorney General of the state, he added that approving the school would open the door for public schools to teach other things like Islamic doctrine or Satanism. So if the court allows this, what prevents the Luciferian church from asking for public funds for them to start a school, right? And then public kids have to go to that and be taught Luciferian doctrine, supported by public funds. Or Islamic school or Adventist schools. Should other people have to pay for our schools to be run? And in fact, the attorney handling the case also was previously the clerk for Justice Samuel Alito, and so he is already well known by the court. So we're seeing this trend in the Roberts Court. So the Supreme Court's divided into different eras based on who the Chief Justice was. So the Roberts Court is when Chief Justice Roberts is. The Warren Court was when Chief Justice Warren was over the court. And so that's how they kind of talk about the Supreme Court like that. And so the Roberts Court, which began in 2006, has ruled in favor of religious organizations far more frequently than any prior court. Over 86% of the time, compared to about 50% of the time for all previous eras, since they started calculating these back in 1953. Now, most of these cases, so in prior eras, most of the religious cases were all religious minorities, right? You had Jehovah's Witness, and you had Mormons, and you had Seventh-day Adventists, cases going up to the Supreme Court. And so they were, usually, religious minorities, not the main Christian sect. But with the Roberts Court, they're taking primarily mainstream Christian organization cases, a lot of them Catholic cases, or cases dealing with Catholic organizations as well. So it's a very pro-mainstream Christian religion court right now, which lines up with Bible prophecy. And so we're seeing the court issue legislation favoring the funding of religious institutions, which is what Ellen White talks about. We also saw that the government was also providing a lot of funding with the USAID work, right? USAID, United States Agency for International Development. It was giving billions of dollars in funding to religious NGOs. And guess who the largest recipient was of USAID monies over the last 10 years? The Vatican. So this is from Vatican News. Their Catholic Relief Services Agency was the largest recipient of USAID money. Over the last 10 years, they got over $4.6 billion for running their operations. So I find that interesting. Well, it just further shows how they continue to operate by they're kind of like a leech, right, and sucking on the state, sucking it dry. Now this started here in the United States back in 1885, where that year the Bureau of Catholic Missions was first established in Washington, D.C., and its chief objective, it stated, was to push Catholic schools upon the government as earnestly as possible. And that September of 1885, they got approval from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And what the Commissioner of Indian Affairs did, because they were wanting to educate the Indians, so the Catholic Church said, hey, we'll solve your problem. We'll go run the schools. You give us the money, we'll run the schools. And so the Commission of Indian Affairs passed a enactment saying the government should be liberal in making contracts with religious denominations to teach Indian children in schools established by those denominations. And so we see this first violation of the Establishment Clause happening there in 1885. For some reason, it wasn't challenged and it was allowed. And so the United States government was paying money directly to churches starting in 1886 for them to teach religion to the Indians and to educate them. And so in 1886, Catholic schools were awarded $118,000. It's a lot of money back in 1886. And all other Protestant schools only received $109,000. Now, fast forward 5 years to 1889, and that year, Catholic schools, were receiving $347,000 compared to all other Protestant schools, $204,000. So they had really learned to use the system and use its funds to spread the Catholic ideology. Well, when President Harrison entered office, he said, whoa, this is a problem, right? This is a violation of the Establishment Clause. And so he worked with some of the senators and were trying to pass a bill to ban this from happening. But what he found was that the forces against him were too strong. And Senator Dawes stated, the present management is not in favor of divorcing the government from them all. But it found that it was impossible to do that. And he said this has been a raid on the government treasury by the churches. And so what they ended up doing was passing a law saying we're not going to allow it to increase any further. And so, but guess what was slipped into the bill? A provision that allowed the Catholic Church to start 3 more schools. We won't allow it to go any further, except the Catholic Church can actually get funding for 3 additional schools. Somehow that got slipped in, I don't know, and got approved. Now, this is what A.T. Jones wrote about at the time. He says, a people may have a perfect constitution, and yet if they neglect it so that the public intelligence falls below the level of the Constitution and the real character of the Constitution is forgotten, then the Constitution is of no more value than so much a blank paper. This is the condition of things in the United States now. So far as the subject of religion and government is concerned, the United States Constitution is as nearly perfect as a human production can be made. It declares an absolute separation between the church or churches and the state, and prohibits the government from having anything to do with the establishing of any religion, or with any religion already established. And yet the people of the United States have so far forgotten these principles and the necessity of maintaining them, that Congress goes on year after year bestowing national aid upon certain churches, and the people say not a word. And so this is another way the Constitution is worthless, is if we don't say something about the violations that are happening, right? It might as well just be a blank piece of paper if we're not, standing up for what it says. And we're not even being taught what it says a lot of times in our schools. Kids need to learn what our Constitution says, and we need to be standing up for it, and we need to be following it even in our own institutions by not accepting the funds from the government. There needs to be a separation of church and state. And we have this warning that the union of church and state, be the degree never so slight, while it may appear to bring the world nearer to the church, does in reality but bring the church nearer to the world. So we think, man, if we can just get this money from the state, look at all these projects we can do to further the gospel, and we think this is great. It's going to help bring the world closer to the church. But she warns us, no, in reality, it brings the church nearer to the world. So the end result is that the church gets closer to the world. We start to rely on the government for funds, and then maybe there's strings attached. Maybe we lose the funding and now we can't do our missions. Or maybe we're not allowed to speak about our true gospel message because we're taking the funds, right? And so there's problems with taking dollars from the state. God has the cattle on 1,000 hills. Let me ask you this. When was the greatest time in Christian history? When was the greatest time where the gospel went to the whole world? The time of the apostles, right? What did Paul say? The gospel has gone to the whole world, right? We saw the Holy Spirit poured out. We saw missionaries go around the world and establish churches, people pouring into our churches. That was the greatest time in Christian history. How much government aid were the apostles getting? How did they do it? How did they send their kids to school and educate them if the government wasn't paying for it? And what about all their properties? They weren't getting, tax-exempt status for their properties. How did they get the gospel out, right? And people were donating and they weren't getting tax deductions. How is that possible that the gospel went out, right? This isn't something we scratch our heads about. The gospel went out because people were moved to give to it because God was working on their hearts. God can sustain His work. We don't need the state to sustain the work of God. In fact, it's cheating on God, right? When we use the state. Now, it's not in all situations. There are examples where we look at when the time after the 70 years where the king of Persia helped them rebuild Jerusalem. And so we see in certain situations where the state did help the church, but America is very unique, in our Constitution, and with our understanding of Bible prophecy, that when the churches go to the state to sustain their institutions, that we know that they are forming that image of the beast. And so we're in a unique place here in America that's different than any of the other governments, right? America is a very unique government. We have that beautiful Constitution that was God-inspired. And so what's the end goal of this? Enforcing, the end goal of using the state to enforce religious ideas and to sustain the institutions. This is what Ellen White tells us. In the movements now in progress in the United States, to secure for the institutions the usages of the church, and usages of the church, the support of the state. So when the movement that we're seeing happening, where the churches are going to the state to secure support for its institutions, she says Protestants are following in the steps of the papists. Is that where we want to be as a church? Following in the steps of the papists? No. She says, nay more. They are opening the door for the papacy to regain in Protestant America the supremacy which she has lost in the old world. And that which gives greater significance to this movement is the fact that the principal object contemplated is the enforcement of what? Sunday observance. So the end goal of getting financial sustenance from the state and using the state to spread Christian ideology is Sunday observance, which we know as Bible students will be the mark of the beast. And we know it's already been upheld. That McGowan decision, remember that McGowan versus Maryland, in 1961? That case was cited in Kennedy versus Bremerton, that Coach Kennedy praying case. They cited it and said, as referring to it as good law, saying just look at what we did in the past, allowing this sort of state action that we found was not a violation of the Establishment Clause. And so our current makeup of the Supreme Court has already approved the Sunday Blue Laws, the McGowan versus Maryland case, as good law. And so we see that, that the first stage of the Sunday law, where you have to rest on the Sabbath, this court, with its current makeup, these justices have already approved that that is good law, that does not violate the Establishment Clause. And so what are we supposed to do? What do we need to do as Protestants? True Protestants, right? She says in Volume 5 of the Testimonies, while the Protestant world, by her attitude, is making concessions to Rome, let us arouse to comprehend the situation and view the contest before us in its true bearings. Let the watchmen now lift up their voice and give the message which is present truth for this time. Let us show the people where we are in prophetic history and seek to arouse the spirit of true Protestantism, a true separation of church and state, right? Awakening the world to a sense of the value of the privileges of religious liberty so long enjoyed. Ellen White tells us that the banner of religious liberty has been passed into the hands of Seventh-day Adventists. It is our job to uphold that banner. The Protestant world has dropped the banner, right? They are uniting with Rome again. And it is our job to uphold that banner of religious liberty and of separation of church and state, and to warn others of the results if we violate that. So God calls for us to be awake, and not just to be awake, but He calls us to be watchmen on the wall, lifting up their voice like a trumpet. And so that is what we need to be doing, is sharing the message, getting it out, and warning others of the path that our nation is on. With that, let's bow our heads for prayer. Father in heaven, Lord, we see the things that are taking place, Lord, in our legislatures, Father, in our judicial system, Lord, and we see how that beautiful constitution that you inspired is being eroded, Lord, separation of church and state. And we know, Lord, that the end goal is to force a false worship that violates your truth, Father, and your Sabbath. Lord, help us to be watchmen on the wall. Lord, help us to be awake, and not just awake, Lord, but give us boldness to speak, Father, and to call sin by its right name, Lord, to call out the violations that are happening against the principles that you have set up for state and church to be separate, Lord, and help us to be faithful in carrying that message throughout this land. In Jesus' name, amen.